Welcome to the 2021 CDRC first annual meeting. I'd like to welcome all of you in attending this conversation that we're having over the course of the next 3 days from November 16th to the 18th. My name is Marco Scito. I am the Executive Director of the Cures Drug Repurposing Collaboratory at the Critical Path Institute, working closely with the FDA in their Cure ID platform. Before I wanted to have an opportunity to explain what the Collaboratory is and provide a little bit of background and some information for those of you that that are new to this this effort and moving forward. And the basic problem here is that of the nearly 10,000 diseases, and that's a rough estimate, as many of you know, there are really only about 2,500 FDA-approved drugs. And because there are multiple drugs that can be used for a single disease, that really works out to roughly, again, approximately 30% of diseases with approved treatments from the FDA. And so that obviously results in a significant number of diseases with no approved treatment. And we need to identify of those diseases where there is a very little investment in finding a cures from industry. Oftentimes, these diseases are neglected. Oftentimes, drug resistance really addresses the challenges in moving those drug treatments through the pipeline. And then there are emerging and re-emerging diseases that, that cause issues as well. But once a drug is approved, and obviously based on knowledge and professional judgment, physicians can actually take the responsibility for prescribing drugs for a different indication. And that's all called off-label drug use. FDA does not endorse that off-label use, but acknowledges that it happens, and it is essentially the practice of medicine. But there's a potential for existing drugs to be used in new ways for new indications. And those ways can actually provide hope for treatments that can help patients, because that's really where a lot of this evidence resides, is the ability to provide that additional hope for patients who do not have a treatment option in mind. So that's really the basis for the Cure Drug Repurposing Collaboratory. This was a public-private partnership that was launched with funding from the FDA and in partnership with FDA and NIH, primarily NCATS, in June of 2020. And the effort here is really to bring stakeholders together to address how drug repurposing can be accelerated. And the main question from this initial discussion was really, can the systematic collection of anecdotal data regarding these off-label prescriptions that are being done all over the place constantly, can those be used to advance drug repurposing? And the effort here is not to have a regulatory win per se right from the beginning, but really just to formulate a hypothesis. Can we identify areas that can be further addressed using clinical trials, but it gives us an impetus, a first look at some data to suggest that this actually may be something that is effective and efficacious. And so we're obviously wanting to generate real world evidence then in order to support a supplement to a drug label. The mission, therefore, has become that CDRC, together with Cure ID, and I'll talk about Cure ID in a few minutes, is to become the global public source of validated real-world data to advance drug repurposing for diseases with the highest levels of unmet medical need. Obviously, in June of 2020, that was the middle of a pandemic that the entire globe was going through, COVID-19. And that was the actual pilot study that we adopted based on conversations with both FDA and NIH. I'd like to also pause to introduce the team because this is a virtual conference. You may not be able to see these individuals if you were present in a face-to-face meeting, but other than myself, who's leading the CDRC team, we have Smith Heavner, our scientific director, who works a lot with electronic health records and is leading the electronic health record extraction team here at CPATH. Dr. Rima Charles, who's a clinical scientist. She's a physician, otolaryngologist from India, and provides a lot of expertise and evidence based on the Cure ID platform. We have project managers, both Chandler Birch and Pamela Dasher, and our project coordinators, Kitty Bogie and Jennifer Stevens. I'd also be remiss without mentioning our interns, which work both in policy and in data entry, literature reviews, and communications, and there are a number of them that are listed here. We also have cross-functional groups within CPATH, and that includes Dan Civilli, our platform development lead within the data DCC, and then Roxanne Olivius in communications, and finally, Dr. Jagdeep Pottichetti at predictive analytics and the quantitative medicine team. So we all work together in collaboration, obviously, with many of the stakeholders. And the advisory committee that has been generated or has been identified as a result of CDRC includes a wide variety of different groups, not only US government, but also foundations, nonprofits, and most of the other individuals that are often associated with the advisory committees, the researchers, the clinicians, most importantly, the patients, but also pharma and industry. And the goal of this advisory committee is really to facilitate the labeling that accurately reflects the drug's demonstrated utility in clinical practice. That is, that real world data evidence to harness both the combination of traditional clinical trials as well as real world evidence to be able to address that. The advisory committee oversees 4 different coordinating committees. There's an infectious disease, there's one on special populations, one on rare diseases, and then we have an operational support coordinating committee that supports many of the work groups that are funded as a result of the coordinating committee team's efforts. And this is the coordinating committees are really where most of the strategic work is being done to define and refine the landscape analysis of the diseases of highest unmet need, prioritize them, establishing working groups, defining the scope, refining the questions, and then eventually communicating and developing strategies for broad public dissemination of results. So underneath these coordinating committees is where most of the work actually gets done. And I'm flashing this up just initially, not to go through each one of these, but really to point out a variety. We can't cover all of these topics, so we're going to be covering a variety of these over the next few days. From rare diseases, both in oncology and non-oncology, and the neonatal working group within special populations, as well as the regulatory, legislative, and policy working group that is in the operational working group section. And lastly, we'll be also exploring the EHR, the electronic health record automated data extraction process for that's surrounding COVID. The work that has been initiated just earlier this year. And all of this data is coming into the NCATS data server databases, of which CureID is the one that has been stood up. But there are plans to include additional CureID-like databases, which include the rare diseases as well as the special populations, in this case, potentially the perinatal treatment repository. So I've talked about CureID a few times, and this is really a platform to capture novel uses of existing drugs. This is a web-based tool that can be downloaded for free. It's available on Google Play and the App Store. It launched back in 2019. I think it was December of 2019 by both FDA and NCATS. And the emphasis here is to capture and share real-world experiences of treating patients through a simple online case report form. So it's the prescribers that are adding this data in. They can contribute, they can explore, and they can also discuss amongst themselves different cases that they've come across that were particularly challenging. And this can be also downloaded into a smartphone. It's an app-based and also in any type of mobile device, whether it's an iPad or something like that. The challenge then has always been to actually secure data from those clinicians or the prescribers. I do want to iterate that there is a major update to this app that should come out by the end of this year and potentially at the beginning of next year. And if you haven't downloaded it as of yet, this is a free download. Please go to cure.ncats.io for the download. Another aspect that we have tried to address as a result of the lack of involvement of clinicians, and clinicians are not doing this on purpose. Obviously, it's a significant amount of effort that is required to submit cases on top of the duties that they're already doing, and especially in the middle of a pandemic. So the FDA has actually applied and secured $9.2 million to aggregate and analyze treatments from electronic health records and disease registries on a global level. And this grant actually came from the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Trust Fund from the Office of the Secretary. The deliverables are fairly broad, and I thought I'd just identify 3 of those, the highest deliverables, with a number of different partners on the bottom right-hand corner of this slide. And that is the expansion of this open access CureID platform that I just mentioned to include not just case report forms from clinicians, but also include EHR and registry level data. Development and the provision of a tool that will automate the extraction of de-identified data elements from electronic health records and registries, again, into that platform. And the procurement and synthesis of data for all COVID-19 positive patients from at least 300 sites in the US and around the world. And the bottom bullet point here is actually quite critical, because what we're doing here is developing the infrastructure, this leave-in infrastructure that can be expanded to other diseases, essentially a flip of a switch. So rather than capturing all COVID cases, we could capture all atypical mycobacteria cases, for example. And the outputs would be modified, obviously, but the infrastructure that's present would still be there. Taking it to the next step is, how do we move from generation of data from electronic health records and real world data to actually clinical evidence? And CDRC, which is actually, this part is led by Emory University, is pursuing a series of 2 separate but related large adaptive platform randomized trials for COVID-19, leveraging much of the investment that's already being made in automated EHR data extraction. So there's an acute inpatient trial, again, using electronic health records, and one that's more a chronic long-term outpatient trial using some electronic health records, but really leveraging a lot of the work that has been initiated over the past 18 months because of COVID on telemedicine and electronic patient-reported outcomes. COVID-19 obviously is going to be used as a proof of concept for these clinical trial designs. But what we're trying to do is reduce the burden for clinicians to participate in clinical trials. Development and adoption of tools in this way, especially if they are implemented at a community setting, it's going to be important not only for clinicians to be able to better interact with patients in a clinical trial and to include them in clinical trials, but also to diversify the patient population that are often underrepresented in clinical trials in general. And what we're trying to do is leverage the existing opportunities to implement this culture change, a simpler trial design, and additional variables in these data collection requirements for advancing clinical trials in these sort of large adaptive platform randomized trial designs. The focus here is on the evaluation of repurposed agents because we're going to be leveraging the data on prior safety, the mechanism of action, and obviously all of this will reduce cost. That doesn't mean that we won't be interested in looking at new chemical entities, but that obviously poses a different level of challenge in incorporating some of those into this design. The bottom line here is that what we want to do is build a leave-in-place integrated infrastructure that is embedded in clinical practice, and although it's being used for COVID-19, is actually going to be used beyond COVID-19 and the interpandemic, and potentially also for the next pandemic. The last sort of aspect of this is the patient impact, because we can't let this level of effort move forward without ensuring that there is patient impact at the end. Oftentimes people look at the label supplement as being the end all and be all, and it's really only the sponsor or the manufacturer who can approach the FDA or most any stringent regulatory authority with a way to supplement or to update a label. And this is a mechanism is primarily for the sponsor to really be able to market an approved drug for the defined indication, again, based on meeting certain evidentiary standards that are put in place by regulators. The primary benefactor here, of course, is the commercial sponsor, is the manufacturer. There are incentives for them to do so. There's a financial incentive when the drug is on patent, but there are, if it's not on patent, there are some challenges. And oftentimes there are new ways, new mechanisms where additional incentives can be leveraged to allow data to be submitted to the FDA. Some of those are pediatric applications, and FDA and MHRA have some of those. There's orphan drug designation that occurs throughout many of the SRAs, and that reduces or allows market exclusivity for specifically rare diseases. But really, we need another novel process to one that actually benefits patients and providers. In utilizing the review process that is currently very rigorous, multidisciplinary, and independent, I think that that's important to engender and keep. But we need an alternative mechanism, especially when a sponsor or manufacturer has no interest in pursuing a label change or the drug is off patent, and something that a patient and a physician actually would like to have, and it's not necessarily totally on the drug sponsor. So developing a sustainable infrastructure to advance drug repurposing is really what we're talking about. And it goes through a number of different stages, which I've outlined a little bit over the course of the last few minutes. So the stages include stage 0 to stage 4, defining diseases, generating hypotheses, confirming those hypotheses, informing clinical practice, and then some regulatory achievements. And the framework goes with this is based on how we prioritize different diseases, capture preclinical data to better understand the nuances, generate real-world data and real-world evidence for hypotheses, looking at clinical trials to confirm those hypotheses, and these clinical trials are more adaptive, platform designed, embedded in clinical practice, which makes much more sense moving forward. And then once the clinical trials are completed, there's an interest in informing clinical practice, and that may be both policy and guidelines, but that will hopefully end up moving forward towards legislation to require new pathways for submission. In each one of these ways, at the beginning, we're focusing the diseases, narrowing it down to the 10,000 or so diseases into only a few so that we can concentrate on what those are and develop stage 1 through stage 3 in a very narrow focus. But where the legislation comes in is that now we become disease agnostic. So although we get small wins individually, that those individual wins potentially can lead up to a process that is disease agnostic and provides an additional pathway for other diseases to come in forward. And all of this is done in collaboration with our stakeholders from academia, regulators, foundations, clinicians, patients, industry, nonprofits, disease societies, and the list goes on. But each one of those are going to be interacting at these stages in a different manner, depending on their level of interest and their expertise. And that's why although we have a large group of stakeholders, they may not be interacting at the same level of effort in each one of these stages as some of the others. So that gives you a little bit of an overview. I wanted to provide this as you start thinking about the next few days, the conversations that are going to happen in these various different formats. And I also welcome you to reach out to any one of us at CDRC if you're interested in participating. We're open and would like to discuss how you can contribute to this effort in a more meaningful way. So I'll stop there and welcome you. Thank you.